Hello and welcome to the Little Woman podcast. Before entering the podcast, I wanted to let you all know that Little Woman podcast now has merchandise available at society6.com/littlewomanpodcast. There you will find stickers, posters, mugs and t-shirts to fulfill all your Little Woman needs. Come and check it out. Link is also in the description. And now, to the podcast. Merry meet, Little Woman fans. Today's comment shoutout goes to Little Woman fan Angela Gordon. Friedrich could have so easily went down to the level that Jo was at just to please her if he had complimented her writing. He wouldn't have lost her at first, but he knew she could do better. He expected more of her. He caught her to higher intellectual and moral plane where he knew she would be happier and more content. Laurie never could have done that for Jo. He never would have been able to encourage her to grow as Friedrich did. Jo and Friedrich argument in the adaptations has bothered me for ages because it doesn't happen in the novel, and lots of Jo and Laurie shippers actually use that as an excuse to hate Friedrich. And just like Angela says, it is actually Laurie who does not have the mental capacity or any kind of interest towards Jo's writing. It's the last episode of season 2. I am working on season 3. I don't have the release date yet, but it will begin sometimes in the end of this year. I will announce the date here in the podcast and all over social media. Since I started to look for Friedrich Bear analysis from university databases, I've been getting tons of emails with studies about Henry Thoreau and Goethe. So I guess I will never run out of reading when it comes to 19th century German and American philosophy. Podcast is going to a break, but I am doing some fanfiction readings on YouTube. Come and find the Little Woman channel on YouTube. I usually post videos on Thursdays. Louisa May Alcott was in her early 30s when she wrote Little Woman. A lot of people don't know this, but Jo's experience writing sensationalism is based on Louisa's experience writing sensationalism. A couple of my listeners have asked me if I could speak more about the way Louisa's Christian worldview affected to the way she saw her sensational stories. That is one of the topics that we are going to touch today. And also all these literal heroes that Louisa had, like Goethe and Walter Emerson, how they inspired Louisa to create Friedrich's character, and the way adaptations between 1917 and 2019 do not include Jo's inner conflicts about writing sensationalism. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, Little Woman podcast. Jo and Friedrich don't argue in the book, so why on earth they argue in the movies? In Little Woman, Jo's conflicts about quality versus money really begins in the chapter Literally Lessons, and this chapter takes place a couple of years before Jo travels to New York, and she is in her early 20s. I've heard people saying that Jo didn't really care what she was writing about, or that she didn't care about the feedback. And you can get that impression from adaptations like 2019 Little Woman, where Jo got mad when she was receiving feedback, which once again shows how this movie didn't really have any respect for Jo or the author. I would highly recommend everyone to read Literary Lessons because it shows very well how Jo wants to improve as a writer and also how she actively seeks feedback from family members, and she wishes that she would have some kind of a mentor who could help her. We will get into that. Jo begins by writing and submitting Stress and Thunder tales to magazines, and she earns some money from it. This is where we get our first German connection. Stress and Thunder, in German known as Sturm und Drang, was a movement in German literature and culture in the end of the 18th century, and Goethe, Louisa's favorite writer, was a prominent figure in the movement. Quote, "Her story was full of desperation and despair, as her limited acquaintance with those uncomfortable emotions enabled her to make it." One of the most famous Sturm und Drang stories is Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther. I made an episode about it. It's called Laurie and Werther, romanticizing the path to self-destruction. Laurie's character arc, it partially comes from Werther. Werther is this handsome aristocratic man who falls for a peasant girl, Lottie, but Lottie is engaged to a respectable man called Albert. where Joe begins to use his heartache as a way of self-sabotage, and eventually that causes his life. In Little Woman, Laurie threatens to take his life if Joe doesn't marry him. That, by the way, is not in the adaptations. So both characters are emotionally blackmailing these women who they say they love. Throughout her life, Louisa struggled with her mood changes. People often dismiss Jo's anger as her just being a teenager, or that she can be angry because she is a feminist. I am a feminist and I say that's bull. Especially because when Jo is angry, she often hurts people around her. In the book, when she has said something rude or mean, she regrets it. She has difficulties to control herself, the impulses. There has been research made that Louisa May Alcott may have had bipolar disorder. I think that might have very well be true. When a person has a bipolar disorder, they quite literally can't always control their temper. Later in life, when she became very sick with mercury poisoning, that would make her mood changes even more severe. Sturm und Drang, Stress and Thunder movement, it was all about the emotional distress. If you ever read Sorrows of Young Werther's moods change very fast. Book is written entirely from Werther's perspective. You never really know what other characters, like Lottie, are thinking. For Louisa, who did experience this emotional distress, Stress and Thunder stories were a way to vent those emotions. In Literary Lessons, Jo begins to write her first novel. It is not Little Woman, it is a Stress and Thunder story. Jo's first book is a flop. When Jo writes it, she asks help from every single member of her family, and every one of them gives her a different advice, and Jo does everything what they are saying. Having copied her novel for the fourth time, read it to all her confidential friends, and submitted it with fear and trembling to 3 publishers, she at last disposed of it, on condition that she would cut it down 1/3 and omit all the parts which she actually admired. As crazy as it sounds, she took away the parts that she herself liked the most. Perhaps that is the reason why the book became a flop. It got mixed, mostly negative reviews and not that many sales. This is what Mommy says. It seems to me that Jo will profit more by making the trial than by waiting, said Mrs. March. Criticism is the best test of such work, for it will show her both unsuspected merits and faults, and help her to do better next time. We are too partial, but the praise and blame of outsiders will prove useful even if she gets but little money. Yes, said Jo, knitting her brows. That's just it. I've been fussing over the thing so long, I really don't know whether it is good, bad or indifferent. It will be great to have cool, impartial persons take a look at it and tell me what they think of it. That is pretty clear foreshadowing for Frederick's character. This is my problem with 2019, 2017 and 1994 Little Women adaptations. Here, Jo, who is actually few years younger than the New York Jo, herself says that she appreciates criticism and wishes that she would have somebody to help her to refine herself as an author and encourage her to leave her comfort zone. This reminds me of the discussion I had with Emily on this podcast earlier, the episode called Jo Can Handle Feedback. Emily said that Jo was rather limited by the place she was living. This is very true. When she travels to New York, she opens herself to new ideas and experiences, both when it comes to her writing and people she meets. In New York, Jo begins to write stories to a sensational magazine called Weekly Volcano. Quote, though very happy in the social atmosphere about her and very busy with the daily work that earned her bread and made it sweeter for the effort, Jo still found time for literary labors. The purpose which now took possession of her wasn't natural to a poor and ambitious girl, but the means she took to gain her end were not the best. When it comes to sensational publishing, Louisa condemns it right away. When Louisa was in her early 20s, she worked for a New York magazine called Frank Leslie's Weekly Illustrated Newspaper. Weekly Illustrated Newspaper was part of Yellow Press. If somebody doesn't know, sensationalism is editorial tactic, where newspapers are being sold with biased or emotional impressions rather than objective journalism. This happens still today. For example, one person only watches news from Fox and the other person watches them from CNN. They get two very different views on world events. A lot of sensationalism today happens on social media, so it is a lot more difficult to control. I will read you a quote about this particular newspaper from Warren Frankey's History of Journalism. The headline, quote, "Startling exposure of the milk trade of New York and Brooklyn," was followed by an apology of sorts. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper rationalized the reporting of the, quote, "sickening details of the swill milk conspiracy," assuring readers, "We are animated solely by desire to benefit our fellow citizens. In exposing the liquid poison that is decimating our population, bringing death into 1,000 homes, and demoralizing the general health of the city. Even with death, decimation and demoralization, further defense of a sensational subject and its sickening details seemed necessary." So the editorial leader declared, "Ours has been no pleasing task. We should not have selected it for pastime or amusement. We would rather have shunned it, as we would avoid a place infected by the plague." Then why sicken the readers? Couldn't the benefits of exposing frauds be achieved without all the details? Apparently not. Leslie's sense of duty was matched by a belief in the power of basic reporting techniques, the power of faithful and accurate illustrations from staff artists, voluminous data from detectives, and nauseating diagnoses of medical doctors whose documents started the crusade. It was not a pretty business, penetrating into the loathsome pest houses. If the, quote, "sickening stench" was not enough, these journalists were maliciously drenched with the filthy liquid because the milkmaids at the distillery milk barns feared being, quote, "truly depicted by the unerring pencil." Thus began weeks of sensational exposures, unusually extensive and sustained for 1858, at about the midway point in that first half-century of institutionalized newspaper reporting. Leslie's swill milk reportage illustrates an ongoing problem. Certain subjects and certain details, label them sensational, find their way into the popular print. Editors must confess that this news will startle, shock, and dismay readers. Editors, however, will seldom admit that such news was intended to merely titillate, entertain, or satisfy morbid curiosity. In fact, the editors commonly profess that they would shun such unpleasantries if not for their grave duty to tell the truth, no matter how horrible. How does an editor dissociate himself or herself from the information printed, from those, quote, "sickening details"? By portraying the techniques of reporting as something akin to runaway technology. Then reporters come as helpless as sorcerer's apprentice. If reporters are not gleeful gatherers of grisly lore, if not lip-smacking solicitors of the sordid and salacious, then what are they? Sometimes they are not reporters at all. They are both innocent tourists and jaded tour guides. At times they are detectives and sanitary inspectors, inmates, or special commissioners, and when they are not overtly posing in their roles, reporters may pretend to be amoral technicians. The broom sweeps them. Thus their reports are products of both their duties and their techniques. They may wash their hands of their sensationalism under such rubrics as "seeing is believing," or through that routine act of reportorial dissociation. "Don't blame me," attribution which transfers responsibility to documentary and interview sources, just as Leslie's distanced itself in the 1858 by warning the squeamish and the prudish not to read, and then claiming it is, however, a record of unimpeachable facts. Yet well into the 20th century, one schooler could look back at the rich narrative reportage, the muckrackers, and credit some of their success in the early 1900s to the claim that they wrote freely, quote, "in a time of oppressive literary gentility." Whatever degree of gentility might have inhibited the literary contemporaries of the muckrackers, many of their journalistic predecessors working for the 19th century publications, were not so oppressed. As you can see, Frank Leslie's newspaper, it was not a reliable source for news or very fact-based. Louise herself did not like Mr. Leslie. He was a newspaper mogul, he was a very wealthy man, and he lived a very lavish lifestyle. Even when Louisa became rich, she was not somebody who bragged with her wealth. Louisa also took it to her agenda to encourage other wealthy people to help the poor. This happens a lot in her novels. For example, in Little Woman, Laurie turns from somebody who took his wealth for granted to a philanthropist, and thanks to that really goes to Amy. Being said that, there is a scene in the novel where Laurie has bought a pair of fashionable gloves to himself, and Joe makes fun of it and criticizes how he spends his money.